My wife doesn't respect me and humiliates me in front of my friends. Now she can't believe that I've reached the tipping point in our marriage and called the lawyers. My wife and I have been together for almost 20 years, and our bedroom has been on a slow but gradual decline for the last 15 years. We sat down and had the talk a few months ago, where we hashed out the details of trying to rekindle the spark we once had. One of the main things we both agreed upon was the need for date nights as well as other things. Things seem to improve, albeit only marginally again, on the one initiating things, and 90% of the time I get shot down. The usual excuses followed are too tired, not in the mood, the child is awake, he's 18 years old, not feeling very well, and my personal favorite, we can't as you've got to be up for work early in the morning. Anyhow, we persisted with the date nights out of 9 that I organized over the last 2 months. My wife canceled 7 of them, often without notice. Some were even planned weeks in advance when she had reason after her work shift and announced she was going out with her friends. When I mentioned the date night we'd had planned, she claimed she'd simply forgotten, despite it being marked on the calendar on the fridge again, her idea. So on to this weekend, I've spent the last 2 weeks setting up a date night. So picture this a whole weekend away, a suite in a 5-star hotel, dinner at a fancy Michelin star restaurant, tickets to the theater, even shopping for some fancy clothes. So I pick her up after work, I've packed some casual clothes for us both, toiletries, etc. I tell her I've got a surprise plan for her and she immediately starts protesting, saying she has things to do. I've told her that everything had been taken off and she didn't have to worry. She raised the issue of clothing, but I informed her that I got it covered. She seemed to calm down at this point and off we set, although the atmosphere in the car was cold, to say the least. Anyway, a few hours later, we arrive at the hotel and check in. She seems to cheer up when she sees the suite we have. Saturday, we headed out shopping ahead of our planned evening. Several hours later, we returned to the hotel to get ready for dinner. After a while, she emerges from the bathroom. I can't put into words how amazing she looked, wearing a dark blue evening gown, matching lingerie, 4-inch heels, jewelry, hair, and makeup done perfectly. Let's just say my jaw was on the floor. When she saw me staring, she smiled at me and gave me a twirl, and she looked as stunning as the day we tied the knot. So the dinner went as well as it could, although there was very little conversation between us. We took a taxi and headed out to the theater. At least I got a thanks for this part. I'd also arranged for a pair of mutual friends to join us at the theater. So we took our seats and enjoyed the show. Just as the intermission started, I reached over and placed my hand over hers to ask her if she liked the show so far. To my surprise, she snatches her hand away from mine like she'd just been bitten by a poisonous snake. She looked me square in the eyes and proceeded to tell me that whatever I was thinking was going to happen tonight when we got back to the hotel, I could forget it. Her words almost dripping with disdain and venom, also loud enough so several people around us heard. Our friends didn't know where to look or what to say. My wife told me to shift because she needed to use the bathroom. At this point, something inside me just snapped and I got up, apologized to our friends, informing them I was leaving, and I hoped they enjoyed the rest of the show. I'd received a text message from my friends just as I got back to our hotel room informing me they'd told my wife that I'd left and that she just shrugged her shoulders. Still seething with mounting anger, I decided I was heading home. So I packed my clothes, caught a taxi to the nearest train station, and managed to get the last train home. This morning I decided to relocate to the guest room. I noticed I needed some new bedroom furniture, so I headed down to IKEA. I've given up building flat packs for the day. My wife, however, has asked what the new furniture is, but I think she realized when she noticed my clothes and other personal items weren't in the master bedroom. She didn't say anything to me until about an hour ago when she asked me why I was being so childish. I politely explained the previous canceled date nights in favor of her friends, and she, in my opinion, completely unnecessarily outburst at me during the intermission at the theater. She just shrugged her shoulders again and asked if intimacy was all I was interested in. I brought up the issue of her attitude when I picked her up from work Friday afternoon with the intent of surprising her. She told me to deal with it. Update: my wife's best friend contacted me and asked what had gone on, as apparently my wife had told her only part of what happened. So I filled her in on all the gory details. To say she was shocked was an understatement. She proceeded to ask me what I planned to do, considering I was planning a trip to Paris for our anniversary. Later in the year, I stated that the trip wasn't going ahead because of her actions at the theater. My darling wife still hasn't apologized for her actions/outburst. She still claims that she may have overreacted slightly to her exact words. Beth promptly called my wife and put her on speakerphone Beth then proceeded to tear her a new end to add insult to injury, spilled the beans about the proposed trip to Paris for our anniversary. My wife proceeded to gush, saying that she knew I'd get over it as I couldn't say no to her. Her happy mood disappeared when Beth informed her that I'd canceled the trip not 10 minutes ago. I've also spoken to a solicitor concerning a separation and eventual divorce. I recently renewed my passport, and when it arrived, my wife's first reaction was to ask if the trip to Paris was back on. I replied, or rather snapped back at her, that no, it wasn't back on, and the possibility of it ever being planned again was virtually zero. She then proceeded to ask if that was the case, and why did I bother renewing my passport? I replied by stating that I have almost 2 months of holiday time saved up from last year and this year, so I'm planning on flying out to California to see an old friend. Her jaw dropped to the floor. She appeared to be trying to say something, but nothing was coming out. Yesterday morning when I got in from work, I found her sitting at the kitchen table along with Beth. My wife appeared to have been crying by the look of her eyes and face. I then reached into my bag, pulled out 2 A4 envelopes, and placed them on the table in front of her. I then explained the contents of the envelopes. The first one contained a rough draft of a separation agreement drawn up by my lawyer, which would likely end in us getting divorced. At hearing my words, she started bawling her eyes out again. Her friend calmed her down and asked her what she thought I'd do, as she mentioned that during our conversation Beth had picked up on my cold demeanor and tone. Beth also suggested that my wife had pushed me too far when she humiliated me in front of our friends after I went to the trouble of organizing everything, which it turns out, by my wife's admission, was something she'd wish I surprised her with. After my wife calmed down, I proceeded to explain that the second envelope contained a list of marriage/personal counselors and instructions for her to choose one. She was then given the ultimatum to choose one of the envelopes. I would be leaving Sunday morning to catch my first flight to the US, and she got until the time I returned to make the decision, as I refused to be spoken to and treated like I was that night. Add in the fact that she didn't see, and I'm still not sure she does that. Her reaction was uncalled for and way over the top. Before she could respond, I told her in no uncertain terms that if she started screaming at me, that the second option would be immediately removed from the equation. I'd also reiterate a bit if I found out she was seeing someone else whilst I was away. Option 1 would be selected by default. Update: I'm finally back home. I received messages, voicemails, emails, and missed calls, mostly from my wife and a few from friends and family. It turns out the friends we were with that fateful weekend had informed my parents of what went on, along with a few other mutual friends who had inquired about my well-being since I'd been pretty much radio silent since I left for my trip. The messages from my wife started with the usual empty platitudes, insincere apologies, etc. I assumed that when I didn't give her the satisfaction of responding, the messages became more menacing and darker in nature, almost to the point of threatening. I rang her and told her that I'd landed back in the UK and I'd be home after I made a quick stop off at my mother's house. She seemed overly affectionate and sweet on the phone and almost had me wondering if it was the same person I left when I headed out to the US. So I spoke to my mom and laid out everything that had happened and why I took the trip abroad, and she said that she understood but was considerably upset that I left without telling her in person. Anyhow, I get home and my wife practically rugby tackles me the second I'm through the door, again showering me with affection as if nothing had happened at all. She made small talk, asking if I'd enjoyed my trip, asking where I'd been and what I'd saw. I waved her off my lap, sat her down on the sofa next to me, and asked her bluntly if she'd decided the 2 envelopes it presented to her before I left. She simply scoffed at me and asked if it was really serious because she assumed that I was just being childish and throwing a tantrum. I informed her that I was deadly serious about it, and if she'd given it any thought, she just smirked at me and told me to stop being stupid and get over it. My reply was that she'd given me her answer and said, "Thanks for letting me know where I stand." At which point, I rang the solicitor who drew up the 2 sets of papers, and although I hated ringing her one Friday afternoon, while she was likely with family, she asked me what choice my wife had made. I informed her that I didn't want to discuss it over the phone and could make an appointment next week to discuss it in person and go over my options. As I wrote down the appointment time, I caught my wife staring daggers at me and looking so red in the face that I thought she might be on the verge of either having a stroke attack or both. After I'd finished the call, I turned to face her, and before she had time to say anything, I told her she'd made her choice and that I was serious about it. Later, I heard her on the phone sobbing to her best friend about the situation, asking for help on how she could fix the situation. I couldn't hear the other half of the conversation, but from the sobs my wife was making, I could only assume that the advice wasn't what she wanted to hear.